Tonight's lecture is over Chapter 16 in your textbook, Sensory, Motor, and Integrative Systems. Chapter 16 begins on page 569. The sensory and motor pathways of the body provide routes for input into the brain and spinal cord and output to targeted organs for responses such as muscle contraction. The purpose of this chapter is to explore the levels and components of sensation, examine somatic sensory pathways, examine the control of body movement, and describe the integrative functions of the cerebrum. In its broadest definition, sensation is the conscious or subconscious awareness of changes in the external or internal environment. The nature of the sensation and the type of reaction generated vary accordingly to the ultimate destination of nerve impulses that convey sensory information to the central nervous system. Sensory impulses that reach the spinal cord may serve as input for spinal reflexes, such as the stretch reflex you learned about in Chapter 13. Sensory impulses that reach the lower brainstem elicit more complex reflexes, such as changes in heart rate or breathing rate. When sensory impulses reach the cerebral cortex, we become consciously aware of the sensory stimuli and can precisely locate and identify specific sensations as in touch, pain, hearing, or taste. Perception is the conscious interpretation of sensations and is primarily a function of the cerebral cortex. We have no perception of some sensory information because it never reaches the cerebral cortex. For example, certain sensory receptors constantly monitor the pressure of blood and blood vessels. Because the nerve impulses conveying blood pressure information propagate to the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata rather than to the cerebral cortex, blood pressure is not consciously perceived. In this next slide, we're going to talk about sensory modalities. Each unique type of sensation, such as touch, pain, vision, or hearing, is called a sensory modality. A given sensory neuron carries information for only one sensory modality. Neurons relaying nerve impulses for touch to the primary somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum do not transmit nerve impulses for pain. Likewise, nerve impulses from the eyes are perceived as sight, and those from the ears are perceived as sounds. So the different sensory modalities can be grouped into two classes, the general senses and the special senses. The general senses refer to both somatic senses and visceral senses. Somatic senses include tactile sensations such as touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle, thermal sensations such as warm and cold, pain sensations, and proprioceptive sensations. Proprioceptive sensations allow the perception of both static, that is the non-moving positions of the limbs and body parts, such as joints and muscles, as well as the movements of the limbs and the head. Visceral senses provide information about the conditions within the internal organs, for example, pressure, stretch, chemicals, nausea, hunger, and temperature. Moving on to the next slide, the special senses include the sensory modalities of smell, taste, vision, hearing, and equilibrium or balance. The process of sensation begins in a sensory receptor, which can either be a specialized cell or the dendrites of a sensory neuron. A given sensory receptor responds vigorously to one particular kind of stimulus. A sensory receptor responds only weakly or not at all to other stimuli. This characteristic of sensory receptors is known as selectivity. This brings us to figure 16.1 on page 571. This cartoon outlines how sensory receptors respond to stimuli by generating receptor potentials. So at step 1, you see the stimulation of the sensory receptor. So an appropriate stimulus must occur within the sensory receptor's receptive field, that is, the body region where the stimulation activates the receptor or produces a response. At step 2, a sensory receptor converts the energy in the stimulus to a graded potential. This is a process known as transduction. At step 3, we see the generation of nerve impulses. So when a graded potential in a sensory neuron reaches threshold, it triggers one or more nerve impulses which then propagate towards the central nervous system. Sensory neurons that conduct nerve impulses from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system are called first-order neurons. At step 4, a particular region of the central nervous system receives and integrates or processes the sensory nerve impulses. Conscious sensations or perceptions are integrated into the cerebral cortex. And this slide is the same figure, but now we're on page 572. Several structural and functional characteristics of sensory receptors can be used to group them into different classes. These include the microscopic structure, the location of the receptors and the origin of the stimuli that activate them, and the type of stimulus that is detected by them. So in free nerve endings, these nerve endings are bare and they lack any structural specializations that can be seen under a light microscope. Free nerve endings are used to detect pain, temperature, tickle, itch, and some touch sensations. Moving on to encapsulated nerve endings, this cartoon is on page 572 and it's still part of figure 16.1. Receptors for other somatic and visceral sensations such as pressure, vibration, and sometimes touch sensations are detected by encapsulated nerve endings. And this next cartoon is the same figure, same page. Sensory receptors for some special senses are specialized separate cells that synapse with sensory neurons. These include hair cells for hearing and equilibrium in the inner ear, gustatory receptors in the taste buds, and photoreceptors in the retina of the eye for vision. The olfactory sensory neurons for the sense of smell are not separate cells. Instead, they are located in the olfactory cilia, which are hair-like structures that project from the dendrite of an olfactory sensory neuron. Moving on to the next slide. Another way to group sensory receptors is based on the location of the receptors and the origin of the stimuli that activate them. Exteroreceptors are located at or near the external surface of the body. They are sensitive to stimuli originating outside of the body and provide information about the external environment. The sensations of hearing, vision, smell, taste, touch, pressure, vibration, temperature, and pain are conveyed by exteroreceptors. Proprioceptors are located in muscles, tendons, and joints. They provide information about equilibrium or balance, and that includes body position, muscle length and tension, and the position and movement of your joints. And that brings us to table 16.1 on page 573. And this table goes through the classifications of sensory receptors. Please review this table on your own time. And this next slide is part of the same table, same page. And this table is also part of the same table and same page. And that brings us to somatic sensations. Somatic sensations are sensations that arise from the stimulation of sensory receptors embedded in the skin or subcutaneous tissue. These receptors can be found in the mucous membranes of the mouth, the vagina, and anus. They can also be found in skeletal muscles, tendons, and joints. The sensory receptors for some somatic sensations are distributed unevenly. Some parts of the body surface are densely populated with receptors, and others only contain a few. The areas with the highest density of somatic receptors are the tip of the tongue, the lips, and the fingertips. Somatic sensations that arise from stimulating the skin surface are cutaneous sensations. There are 4 modalities of somatic sensations: tactile, thermal, pain, and proprioceptive. The tactile sensations include touch, pressure, vibration, itch, and tickle. Although we perceive differences among these sensations, they arise by the activation of some of the same types of receptors. Several types of encapsulated mechanoreceptors attached to large diameter myelinated A fibers mediate sensations of touch, pressure, and vibration. Other tactile sensations, such as itch and tickle, are detected by free nerve endings attached to small diameter unmyelinated C fibers. Recall that the larger diameter myelinated axons propagate nerve impulses more rapidly than do the smaller diameter unmyelinated axons. Tactile receptors in the skin or subcutaneous tissue include tactile corpuscles, hair root plexuses, non-capsulated sensory corpuscles, lamellar corpuscles, bulbous corpuscles, and free nerve endings. The sensation of touch generally results from stimulation of tactile receptors in the skin or subcutaneous tissue. Pressure is a sustained sensation that is felt over a larger area than touch. It also occurs with deeper deformation of the skin and the subcutaneous tissue. Sensations of vibration result from a rapidly repetitive sensory signal from the tactile receptors. The receptors for vibration sensations are lamellar corpuscles and tactile corpuscles. Itch is a sensation that results from the stimulation of free nerve endings by certain chemicals, such as histamine, or by antigens, such as those in the saliva injected from a mosquito bite. And these are often local inflammatory responses. Scratching usually alleviates itching by activating a pathway that blocks the transmission of the itch signal through the spinal cord. Free nerve endings are thought to mediate tickle sensations. This intriguing sensation typically arises when someone else touches you, not when you touch yourself. The solution to this puzzle seems to lie in the nerve impulses that conduct to and from the cerebellum when you are moving your fingers and touching yourself. That doesn't occur when someone else is tickling you. And that brings us to figure 16.2 on page 574. In this cartoon, we see the structure and location of sensory receptors in the skin and subcutaneous tissue. The somatic sensations of touch, pressure, vibration, warmth, cold, and pain arise from sensory receptors in the skin, subcutaneous tissue, and mucous membranes. Moving on to the next slide, pain is indispensable for survival. It serves as a protective function by signaling the presence of noxious, tissue-damaging conditions. From a medical standpoint, the subjective description and indication of the location of pain may help pinpoint the underlying cause of disease. Nociceptors are the receptors for pain. These receptors are free nerve endings found in every tissue of the body except for the brain. There are 2 types of pain. These types are fast and slow. The perception of fast pain occurs very rapidly, usually within 0.1 second after a stimulus is applied, because the nerve impulses propagate along medium diameter myelinated A fibers. This type of pain is also known as acute, sharp, or pricking pain. The pain felt from a needle puncture or knife cut to the skin is fast pain. Fast pain is not felt in deeper tissues of the body. The perception of slow pain, in contrast, begins a second or more after the stimulus is applied. It then gradually increases in intensity over a period of several seconds or minutes. Impulses for slow pain are conducted along small diameter unmyelinated C fibers. This type of pain, which may be excruciating, is also referred to as chronic, burning, aching, or throbbing pain. Slow pain can occur both in the skin and in deeper tissues or internal organs. An example is the pain associated with a toothache. You can perceive the difference in the onset of these two types of pain best when you injure a body part that is far from the brain. This is because the conduction distance is long. For instance, when you stub your toe, you first feel a sharp sensation of fast pain and then feel the slower, aching sensation of slow pain. Pain that arises from the stimulation of receptors in the skin is called superficial somatic pain. Moving on to the next slide. Stimulation of receptors in skeletal muscles, joints, tendons, and fascia causes deep somatic pain. Visceral pain results from the stimulation of nociceptors in the visceral organs. If the stimulation is diffuse, in other words, it involves a large area, visceral pain can be severe. Diffuse stimulation of visceral nociceptors might result from the distension or ischemia of an internal organ. For example, a kidney stone or a gallstone might cause severe pain by obstructing and distending the ureter or bile duct. And this brings us to figure 16.3 on page 576. Nociceptors are present in almost every tissue of the body. And we can see that in this cartoon because it shows the distribution of pain. The colored parts indicate skin areas to which visceral pain is referred. Moving on to the next slide, proprioceptive sensations allow us to recognize that parts of our body belong to us. In other words, they belong to ourself. They also allow us to know where our head and limbs are located and how far they are moving even if we are not looking at them. So we can walk, type, and dress without using our eyes. Kinesthesia is the perception of body movements. Proprioceptive sensations arise in receptors termed proprioceptors. Those proprioceptors are embedded in the muscles and tendons. They inform us of the degree to which the muscles are contracted, the amount of tension on the tendons, and the position of joints. Hair cells of the inner ear monitor the orientation of the head relative to the ground and head position during movements. Moving on to muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are the proprioceptors that monitor changes in the length of skeletal muscles and participate in stretch reflexes. By adjusting how vigorously a muscle spindle responds to the stretching of a skeletal muscle, the brain sets an overall level of muscle tone. Muscle tone is the small degree of contraction that is present while the muscle is at rest. Tendon organs are slowly adapting receptors located at the junction of a tendon and a muscle. By initiating tendon reflexes, tendon organs protect tendons and their associated muscles from damage due to excessive tension. There are several types of joint kinesthetic receptors. These are present within and around the articular capsules of the synovial joints. Free nerve endings and bulbous corpuscles in the capsules of joints respond to pressure. Small lamellar corpuscles in the connective tissue outside the articular capsules respond to acceleration and deceleration of joints during movement. And that brings us to figure 16.4 on page 578. This cartoon shows the two types of proprioceptors. The two types are a muscle spindle and a tendon organ. In muscle spindles, which monitor changes in skeletal muscle length, sensory nerve endings wrap around the central portion of the intrafusal muscle fibers. In tendon organs, which monitor the force of muscle contraction, sensory nerve endings are activated by increasing tension on a tendon. And that brings us to table 16.2 on page 579, and this summarizes the receptors for the somatic sensations. Please review this table on your own time. This next slide, labeled tactile receptors, is also part of the same table and same page. And this slide labeled thermoreceptors and pain receptors is also part of the same table. And this slide labeled proprioceptors is also part of the same table. Please review this on your own time. Moving on to somatic sensory pathways. The somatic sensory pathways relay information from somatic sensory receptors in the skin, muscles, and joints to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe of the cerebrum and to the cerebellum. A somatic sensory pathway consists of thousands of sets of 3 neurons. These 3 neurons are classified as first, second, and third order neurons. First-order neurons, or primary neurons, are sensory neurons that conduct nerve impulses from somatic sensory receptors into the brainstem or spinal cord. All other neurons in a somatic sensory pathway are interneurons, which are located completely within the central nervous system. From the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, teeth, and eyes, somatic sensory impulses propagate along cranial nerves into the brainstem. From the neck, trunk, limbs, and posterior aspect of the head, somatic sensory impulses propagate along spinal nerves into the spinal cord. Second-order neurons, or secondary neurons, conduct nerve impulses from the brainstem or spinal cord to the thalamus. Axons of the secondary neurons decussate as they course through the brainstem or spinal cord before ascending to the thalamus. Third-order neurons, or tertiary neurons, conduct nerve impulses from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory cortex on the same side. As the impulses reach the primary somatosensory cortex, perception of the sensation occurs. Because the axons of second-order neurons decussate as they pass through the brainstem or spinal cord, somatic sensory information on one side of the body is perceived by the primary somatosensory cortex on the opposite side of the brain. Moving on to the next slide. Somatic sensory impulses ascend to the cerebral cortex via 3 general pathways. These pathways are the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, the anterolateral pathway, and the trigeminal thalamic pathway. Somatic sensory neuron pathways relay information from somatic sensory receptors to the primary somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe, decussate either in the brainstem or spinal cord. Therefore, somatic sensations that occur on one side of the body are perceived by the primary somatosensory cortex on the opposite side of the brain. Moving on to the next slide. The posterior column medial lemniscus pathway conveys nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception to the cerebral cortex. This pathway begins with first-order neurons that extend from the peripheral sensory receptors into the spinal cord. After entering the spinal cord, axons of these first-order neurons ascend to the medulla via a tract known as the posterior column. Once the axons of the first-order neurons are in the medulla, they synapse with second-order neurons. Axons of the second-order neurons cross to the opposite side of the medulla and enter the medial lemniscus. This is a thin, ribbon-like projection that extends from the medulla to the thalamus. In the thalamus, the axon terminals of a second-order neuron synapse with third-order neurons. Axons of the third-order neuron, in turn, project to the primary somatosensory cortex of the cerebrum. And this is figure 16.5 on page 581, and this shows the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. Moving on to the anterolateral pathway, this pathway conveys nerve impulses for pain, temperature, touch, and pressure to the cerebral cortex. In this pathway, primary neurons extend from the peripheral sensory receptors into the spinal cord where they synapse with second-order neurons. Then the axons of the secondary neurons decussate in the spinal cord and then ascend to the thalamus as the spinothalamic tract. In the thalamus, the axons of the secondary neurons synapse with the tertiary neurons The tertiary neurons project their axons to the primary somatosensory cortex in the cerebrum. And this cartoon is on page 581. This is 16.6. And this shows the anterolateral pathway. Moving on to the trigeminal thalamic pathway, nerve impulses for pain, temperature, touch, proprioception from the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth ascend to the cerebral cortex via the trigeminal thalamic pathway. Primary neurons of the trigeminal thalamic pathway extend from sensory receptors in the face, nasal cavity, oral cavity, and teeth into the pons through the trigeminal 5 nerves. The cell bodies of these first-order neurons are in the trigeminal ganglion. The axon terminals of some first-order neurons synapse with the secondary neurons in the pons. The axons of the first-order neurons descend into the medulla to synapse with second-order neurons. The axons of the second-order neurons cross to the opposite side of the pons and medulla and then ascend as a trigeminal thalamic tract into the thalamus. In the thalamus, the axon terminals of the second-order neurons synapse with the third-order neurons, which project their axons to the primary somatosensory cortex on the same side of the cerebral cortex as the thalamus. And that brings us to figure 16.7 on page 582. This cartoon outlines the trigeminal thalamic pathway. Moving on to the next slide, the precise localization of somatic sensations occurs when nerve impulses arrive at the primary somatosensory cortex. This occupies the postcentral gyri of the parietal lobes of the cerebral cortex. Each region in this area receives sensory input from a different part of the body. And if we turn to page 583, we see that figure 16.8a maps the destination of somatic sensory signals from different parts of the left side of the body in the primary somatosensory cortex of the right cerebral hemisphere. The left cerebral hemisphere has a similar primary somatosensory cortex that receives sensory input from the right side of the body. Note that some parts of the body, chiefly the lips, face, tongue, and hand, provide input to large regions in the primary somatosensory cortex. Other parts of the body, such as the trunk and lower limbs, project to much smaller cortical regions. Moving on to the next slide, there are 2 tracts in the spinal cord, the anterior spinocerebellar tract and the posterior spinocerebellar tract. These are the main routes that the proprioceptive nerve impulses take to reach the cerebellum. Although they are not consciously perceived, sensory nerve impulses conveyed to the cerebellum along these 2 pathways are critical for posture, balance, and coordination of skilled movements. And this slide starts table 16.3 on page 583. This table outlines the major somatic sensory tracts and pathways. It starts with the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, and it says that it conveys nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and proprioception. And this slide is the same table 16.3, but now we're on page 584, and this particular slide outlines the anterolateral pathway, which conveys nerve impulses for pain, temperature, touch, and pressure. And this slide is also part of table 16.3, and it outlines the trigeminal thalamic pathway. This pathway conveys nerve impulses for pain, temperature, touch, and proprioception. And again, this is also part of table 16.3, also on page 584. And this slide outlines the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar pathways. These pathways convey nerve impulses from proprioceptors of one side of the body to the same side of the cerebellum. Moving on to the next slide, neural circuits in the brain and spinal cord orchestrate all voluntary movements. Ultimately, All excitatory and inhibitory signals that control movement converge on motor neurons that extend out of the brainstem and spinal cord to innervate the skeletal muscles in the body. These neurons are known as the lower motor neurons because they have their cell bodies in the lower parts of the central nervous system. Moving on to the next slide. Neurons in 4 distinct but highly interactive neural circuits participate in the control of movement by providing input to the lower motor neurons. These 4 motor pathways include the local circuit neurons, the upper motor neurons, the basal nuclei neurons, and the cerebellar neurons. And this slide is figure 16.9 on page 585. This outlines the neural circuits that regulate the lower motor neurons. So at number 1, we see the local circuit neurons. Input arrives at lower motor neurons from the nearby inner neurons called the local circuit neurons. These neurons are located close to the lower motor neuron cell bodies in the brainstem and spinal cord. Local circuit neurons receive input from somatic sensory receptors such as nociceptors and muscle spindles, as well as from higher centers in the brain. They help coordinate rhythmic activity in specific muscle groups such as alternating flexion and extension of the lower limbs during walking. And that brings us to number 2, the upper motor neurons. An upper motor neuron is actually an inner neuron and not a true motor neuron. But both local circuit neurons and lower motor neurons receive input from the upper motor neurons. Upper motor neurons have cell bodies and motor processing centers in the upper parts of the central nervous system. Most upper motor neurons synapse with local circuit neurons, which in turn synapse with lower motor neurons. However, there are a few upper motor neurons that synapse directly with lower motor neurons. Upper motor neurons from the primary motor cortex of the cerebrum are essential for the planning and execution of voluntary movements of the body. At number 3, we see the corpus striatum neurons. These neurons assist movement by providing input to the upper motor neurons. Neural circuits interconnect the corpus striatum nuclei with motor areas of the cerebral cortex via the thalamus and the brainstem. These circuits help initiate and terminate movements, suppress unwanted movements, and establish a normal level of muscle tone. And number 4 points out the cerebellar neurons. The cerebellar neurons also aid movement by controlling the activity of upper motor neurons. Neural circuits interconnect the cerebellum with the motor areas of the cerebral cortex via the thalamus and the brainstem. A prime function of the cerebellum is to monitor differences between intended movements and movements actually performed. Then it issues commands to the upper motor neurons to reduce errors in movement. The cerebellum thus coordinates body movements and helps maintain normal posture and balance. Moving on to the next slide, the upper motor neurons extend to the lower motor neurons via 2 types of pathways. One is the direct motor pathway, which delivers signals to the lower motor neurons from the cerebral cortex, and the second one is the indirect motor pathway, which delivers signals to the lower motor neurons from motor centers in the basal nuclei, cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex. Moving on to direct motor pathways, the axons of upper motor neurons extend from the brain to the lower motor neurons via 2 types of pathways, direct and indirect. Direct motor pathways provide input to the lower motor neurons via axons that extend directly from the primary motor cortex. Indirect motor pathways provide input to the lower motor neurons from motor centers in the brainstem. Direct and indirect pathways both govern generation of nerve impulses in the lower motor neurons, the neurons that stimulate the contraction of skeletal muscles. Furthermore, nerve impulses for voluntary movements propagate from the primary motor cortex to the lower motor neurons via the direct motor pathways. There are 2 direct motor pathways used for voluntary movement. One is the cortical spinal pathway, and the other is the cortical bulbar pathway. The cortical spinal pathway conducts nerve impulses for the control of muscles of the limbs and the trunk. The cortical bulbar pathway conducts nerve impulses for the control of skeletal muscles in the head. So this cartoon is on page 587. This is figure 16.10. This cartoon is outlining the lateral cortical spinal tract. Cortical spinal axons that decussate in the medulla form the lateral cortical spinal tract. In the lateral white funiculus of the spinal cord, these axons synapse with local circuit neurons or lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. Axons of these lower motor neurons exit the cord in the anterior roots of the spinal nerves and terminate in skeletal muscles that produce movements of the distal parts of the limbs. The distal muscles are responsible for precise, agile, and highly skilled movements. An example would be the movements of the hand that are required to play a piano. And this next slide is also figure 16.10 on page 587, but now we're outlining the anterior cortical spinal tract. Cortical spinal axons that do not decussate in the medulla form the anterior cortical spinal tract in the anterior white funiculus of the spinal cord. At each spinal cord level, some of these axons decussate via the anterior white commissure. Then, they synapse with local circuit neurons or lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. Axons of these lower motor neurons exit the cord in the anterior roots of the spinal nerves. They terminate in skeletal muscles that control the movements of the trunk and the proximal parts of the limbs. And this cartoon is figure 16.11 on page 588. This cartoon outlines the cortical bulbar pathway. This pathway conducts nerve impulses for the control of skeletal muscles in the head. Axons of the upper motor neurons from the primary motor cortex from the cortical bulbar tract descend along with the cortical spinal tracts through the internal capsule of the cerebrum and the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. Some of the axons of the cortical bulbar tract decussate, others do not. The axons terminate in the motor nuclei of 9 pairs of the cranial nerves in the brainstem and the spinal cord. The lower motor neurons of the cranial nerves convey nerve impulses that control the precise, voluntary movements of the eyes, tongue, and neck, plus chewing, facial expression, speech, and swallowing. And that brings us to the indirect motor pathways. The brainstem motor center gives rise to the indirect motor pathways. These include all somatic motor tracts other than the cortical spinal and the cortical bulbar tracts. Axons of the upper motor neurons descend from the brainstem motor centers into 5 major tracts of the spinal cord and terminates on the local circuit neurons or lower motor neurons. These tracts include the rubrospinal, tectospinal, vestibulospinal, lateral reticulospinal, and the medial reticulospinal. In general, the indirect motor pathways convey nerve impulses from the brainstem to cause involuntary movements that regulate posture, balance, muscle tone, and reflexive movements of the head and trunk. An exception is the rubrospinal tract, which plays an ancillary role to the lateral cortical spinal tract in the regulation of voluntary movements of the upper limbs. And that brings us to figure 16.12 on page 588. This cartoon outlines the indirect motor pathways. So for simplicity's sake, the vestibular nucleus is shown only in the pons. The reticular formation is shown only in the medulla, and only one reticulospinal tract is shown in the spinal cord. And this slide takes us back to figure 16.8 on page 583. And it's just pointing out that each point of the body maps to a specific region in the primary motor area. And that brings us to table 16.4 on page 590. This table outlines the major somatic motor tracts and pathways. So here we see the lateral corticospinal pathway, which conveys nerve impulses from the primary motor cortex to skeletal muscles on opposite sides of the body for precise, voluntary movements of the distal parts of the limbs. And this next slide is the same table, the same page, and it's outlining the anterior corticospinal pathway, which conveys nerve impulses from the primary motor cortex to the skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body for movements of the trunk and proximal parts of the limbs. And this slide is also part of the same table, same page, and it's outlining the corticobulbar pathway. This pathway conveys nerve impulses from the primary motor cortex to the skeletal muscles of the head to coordinate precise, voluntary movements. And in this slide of the same table on the same page, we see the indirect motor pathways, which include the rubrospinal pathway that conveys nerve impulses from the red nucleus to the contralateral skeletal muscles that govern precise voluntary movements of the distal parts of the upper limbs. The technospinal pathway, which conveys nerve impulses from the superior collicus to the contralateral skeletal muscles that reflexively move the head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual or auditory stimuli. The vestibulospinal pathway conveys nerve impulses from the vestibular nucleus to the ipsilateral skeletal muscles of the trunk and proximal parts of the limbs for maintaining posture and balance in response to head movements. And at the bottom, we see the lateral and medial reticulospinal pathways. These pathways convey nerve impulses from the reticular formation to the ipsilateral skeletal muscles of the trunk and proximal parts of the limbs for maintaining posture and regulating muscle tone in response to ongoing body movements. So moving on to the next slide, in addition to maintaining proper posture and balance, the cerebellum is active in both learning and performing rapid, coordinated, highly skilled movements such as hitting a golf ball, speaking, and swimming. The cerebellum is involved in performing 4 activities. These activities include monitoring intentions for movement, monitoring actual movement, comparing command signals with sensory information, and sending out corrective feedback. And this is figure 16.13 on page 591. So we see at number 1, the monitoring intentions for movement. This is where the cerebellum receives nerve impulses from the motor cortex and the corpus striatum via the pontine nuclei in the pons regarding what movements are planned. And that is in the red arrows. At number 2, the cerebellum is monitoring actual movement. The cerebellum receives input from proprioceptors in joints and muscles that reveal what is actually happening. These nerve impulses travel in the anterior and posterior spinal cerebellar tracts. Nerve impulses from the vestibular apparatus in the inner ear and from the eyes also enter the cerebellum. At number 3, the cerebellum is comparing command signals with sensory information. So the cerebellum compares intentions for movement with the actual movement that is being performed. And then at number 4, the cerebellum sends out corrective feedback. If there's a discrepancy between the intended and the actual movement, the cerebellum sends feedback to your upper motor neurons. This information travels via the thalamus to the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex, but goes directly to the upper motor neurons in the brainstem motor centers. You can see that in the green arrows. As the movements occur, the cerebellum continually provides error corrections to upper motor neurons, which decrease errors and smooth out any motion. Over longer periods, it also contributes to the learning of new motor skills. We now turn to a fascinating, though incompletely understood function of the cerebrum, that is integration, which is the processing of sensory information by analyzing and storing it and making decisions for various responses. The integrative functions include cerebral activities such as wakefulness, sleep, learning, memory, and language. Humans sleep and awaken in a 24-hour cycle called a circadian rhythm. That rhythm is established by the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the hypothalamus. A person who is awake, in a state of readiness, and is able to react consciously to various stimuli. EEG recordings show that the cerebral cortex is very active during wakefulness. Fewer impulses arise during most stages of sleep. Sleep is a state of altered consciousness or partial unconsciousness from which an individual can be aroused. Arousal is the awakening from sleep. Although it is essential, the exact functions of sleep are still unclear. Sleep deprivation impairs attention, learning, and performance. Normal sleep consists of two components: non-rapid eye movement and rapid eye movement. Non-rapid eye moving sleep consists of 4 gradually merging stages. The first stage is a transition stage between wakefulness and sleep. This normally lasts about 1 to 7 minutes. The person is relaxed with the eyes closed and has fleeting thoughts. People awakened during this stage often say they have not been sleeping. The second stage is what we call light sleep. In this stage, a person is easy to awaken. Fragments of dreams may be experienced, and the eyes may slowly roll from side to side. Stage 3 is a period of moderately deep sleep. Body temperature and blood pressure decreases, and it is a little more difficult to awaken the person. This stage occurs about 20 minutes after falling asleep. And stage 4 is the deepest level of sleep. Although the brain metabolism decreases significantly and body temperature drops slightly at this time, most reflexes are intact. Also, muscle tone is decreased only slightly. During this stage, it is very difficult to awaken a person. During REM sleep, the eyes move rapidly back and forth under closed eyelids. REM sleep is also known as paradoxical sleep because EEG readings taken during this time show high-frequency, small amplitude waves which are similar to those of a person who is awake. Surprisingly, neuronal activity is high during REM sleep. Brain blood flow and oxygen use are actually higher during REM sleep than during intense mental or physical activity while awake. In spite of this high amount of neuronal activity, it is even more difficult to awaken a person during REM sleep than during any of the stages of non-REM sleep. So recall that sleep is a state of unconsciousness from which an individual can be aroused by stimuli. In contrast, a coma is a state of unconsciousness in which an individual has little or no response to stimuli. Causes of coma include head injuries, damages to the reticular activating system, brain infections, alcohol intoxication, and drug overdoses. If brain damage is minor or reversible, a person may come out of a coma and recover fully. However, if the brain damage is severe and irreversible, a full recovery is unlikely. After a few weeks of being in a coma, some patients enter into a persistent vegetative state in which the patient has normal sleep-wake cycles but does not have an awareness of the surroundings. Individuals in this state are unable to speak or to respond to commands. They may smile, laugh, or cry, but do not understand the meaning of these actions. It is also important to point out that people who are in a coma or a persistent vegetative state are not brain dead because their EEGs still exhibit waveform activity. One of the criteria used to confirm that brain death has occurred is the absence of brain waves. In other words, a flat EEG. And that brings us to learning and memory. Without memory, we would repeat mistakes and be unable to learn. Similarly, we would not be able to repeat our successes or accomplishments except by chance. Although both learning and memory have been studied extensively, we still have no completely satisfactory explanation for how we recall information or how we remember events. However, we do know something about how information is acquired and stored, and it is clear that there are different categories of memory. Learning is the ability to acquire new information or skills through instruction or experience. There are two main categories of learning: associative learning and non-associative learning. Associative learning occurs when a connection is made between two stimuli, and non-associative learning occurs when repeated exposure to a single stimulus causes a change in the behavior. Memory is the process by which information acquired through learning is stored and retrieved. There are two main types of memory: declarative memory and procedural memory. Declarative memory is the memory of experiences that can be verbalized, such as facts, events, objects, names, and places. Procedural memory is the memory of motor skills, procedures, and rules. Memory, whether declarative or procedural, occurs in stages over a period of time. Short-term memory is a temporary ability to remember a few pieces of information for seconds to minutes. Long-term memory can last from days to years. Animals as diverse as ants, birds, whales, and humans have developed ways to communicate with members of their own species. Humans use language to communicate with one another. Language is a system of vocal sounds and symbols that conveys information. Most commonly, it is spoken or written. The cerebral cortex contains two language areas. One is the Wernicke's association area, and the other is the Broca's motor area. The Wernicke's association area is found in the temporal lobe, and it interprets the meaning of written or spoken words. It essentially translates words into thoughts. Wernicke's area receives input from the primary visual area for written words and from the primary auditory area for spoken words. Broca's motor area, on the other hand, is located in the frontal lobe. This is active as you translate thoughts into speech. To accomplish this function, Broca's area receives input from Wernicke's area and then generates a motor pattern for activation of the muscles needed for words that you want to say. The motor pattern is transmitted from Broca's area to the primary motor cortex, which in turn activates the appropriate speech muscles. The contraction of your speech muscles enabled you to speak your thoughts. And that brings us to disorders and homeostatic imbalances. Parkinson's disease is a progressive disorder of the central nervous system. In Parkinson's, the neurotransmitters that release dopamine degenerate. Also, in Parkinson's patients, involuntary skeletal muscle contractions often interfere with voluntary movement. For instance, muscles of the upper limb may alternately contract and relax, causing the hand to shake. This shaking is called tremor, and this is the most common symptom of Parkinson's. Motor performance is also impaired by bradykinesia. This is a slowness of movements. Activities such as shaving, cutting food, and buttoning a shirt may take longer and become increasingly more difficult as the disease progresses. Also, muscular movements may exhibit hypokinesia. This is a state where muscular movements are decreased. For example, words are written smaller, letters are poorly formed, and eventually handwriting becomes illegible. And that concludes tonight's lecture.